It was a crisp autumn morning when I boarded the 7:15 a.m. train from Philadelphia to New York City. I was on my way to a job interview, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. My resume was tucked neatly into a leather portfolio, and I'd spent the previous night rehearsing answers to every possible interview question I could think of. The train was packed, as usual, but I managed to find a seat near the window. Opposite me, two passengers settled into their seats, a man in his early 40s and a woman who looked to be in her late 20s. They didn't appear to know each other, but as the train pulled out of the station, they struck up a conversation. At first, I tried not to listen. Eavesdropping wasn't my style, and I had my own thoughts to wrestle with. But something about their voices, the man's calm, measured tone and the woman's tentative, almost fragile responses, drew me in. It began innocuously enough. They exchanged pleasantries about the weather and the city. Then, the man asked her, "So, what's taking you to New York today?" There was a pause before she replied, "I'm going to see someone. Someone I haven't seen in a long time." Her voice cracked ever so slightly, and that's when I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary chat. The man introduced himself as Peter, a corporate lawyer who commuted between the two cities. The woman, Emma, hesitated before offering her name, as if she was unsure whether to trust him. She admitted she wasn't a regular commuter and that this trip was special. "I'm meeting my father," she finally said. Peter nodded, waiting for her to elaborate. When she didn't, he asked gently, "Are you close with him?" Emma let out a bitter laugh. "Not exactly. I haven't seen him in over 10 years. I pretended to look out the window, but my ears were glued to their conversation. She explained that her parents had divorced when she was a teenager. Her father had remarried quickly, and the relationship between them had deteriorated. He stopped coming to my birthdays, didn't call on holidays. Eventually, I stopped expecting anything from him." "Why now?" Peter asked, his tone neutral. Emma sighed. "He's sick. Cancer. His wife called me last week and said he wants to see me. I don't know why I'm going, honestly. Maybe I want closure. Maybe I just want to tell him how much he hurt me." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Peter, to my surprise, began to share his own story. He spoke about his estranged brother, someone he hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 decades. "We had a falling out over something stupid," he admitted. "It feels ridiculous now, but at the time, it felt like the end of the world." "Have you tried reaching out?" Emma asked. Peter shook his head. "I've thought about it, but I guess pride gets in the way. And fear. What if he doesn't want to hear from me?" For the first time, Emma smiled, a small, sad smile. "That's exactly how I feel about my dad. I'm terrified he'll say something that'll hurt me all over again." Their conversation ebbed and flowed over the course of the 2-hour ride. They talked about forgiveness, family, and the weight of unresolved feelings. Peter encouraged Emma to be honest with her father, to say the things she'd held back for years. "Even if it doesn't go the way you hope," he said, "at least you'll know you tried." Regret is a heavy thing to carry. Emma nodded, her eyes misty. "Maybe you should call your brother," she suggested. "If nothing else, to lighten that load." Peter chuckled softly. "Maybe I will." When the train pulled into Penn Station, I felt an odd sense of loss as I watched them part ways. Emma gave Peter a small wave before disappearing into the crowd, and he lingered for a moment, staring after her, as if lost in thought. I never found out what happened with Emma and her father or if Peter ever called his brother. But their conversation stayed with me, replaying in my mind like a favorite song on repeat. That night, after my interview, which went surprisingly well, I found myself dialing a number I hadn't called in years. It was my college roommate, Mark, someone I'd lost touch with after a falling out over a petty argument. He answered on the second ring, and after a brief, awkward silence, I said, "Hey, it's me. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." There was another pause before he replied, "I'm glad you called." Sometimes, the most profound lessons come from the unlikeliest places: a train ride, a conversation between strangers, a moment of vulnerability. Emma and Peter will never know how much they impacted me that day. But if I ever get the chance, I hope to thank them. Second story. I've always considered myself an organized person, or at least I used to. I had my life planned out to the tiniest detail: graduate college, land a solid job, work my way up, and hopefully retire comfortably. Simple, right? Well, life doesn't care much for simple plans. I learned that the hard way one Wednesday morning in October. It all started with what should have been a routine commute. I had an important job interview lined up, a big one. The kind of opportunity you imagine bragging about at reunions, with phrases like senior executive casually thrown in. I woke up early, reviewed my portfolio, practiced answers to tricky interview questions, and even wore my lucky tie. But fate, as it turned out, had a different plan. I left my apartment an hour early, giving myself what I thought was more than enough time to navigate the unpredictable chaos of city transportation. The subway, however, had other ideas. An equipment malfunction turned my 30-minute ride into an hour-long ordeal. By the time I emerged from the underground, sweating bullets and cursing under my breath, I had mere minutes to spare. I decided to book a rideshare to save time. Big mistake. The driver took a wrong turn, then got stuck in gridlock traffic near the construction zone that seemed to pop up overnight. My interview time came and went as I sat helplessly in the back seat. By the time I reached the office building, I was already half an hour late. The receptionist at the front desk gave me a polite but pitying smile as she informed me that the hiring manager had moved on to their next appointment. My stomach sank. I felt a mix of shame, anger, and frustration. After all my preparation, this was how it ended? I dragged myself to the nearest coffee shop to regroup. That's when things took an unexpected turn. As I sat sipping a lukewarm latte, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, I overheard a conversation at the next table. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, was frantically explaining something to an older man, gesturing wildly at her laptop. She seemed stressed, muttering about a last-minute cancellation and how they needed someone to fill in ASAP. Out of curiosity, or maybe desperation, I leaned over and said, "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing. What exactly are you looking for?" The woman turned to me, her eyes widening with a mix of surprise and hope. "Do you have any experience with event planning?" Now, I didn't exactly have experience in the traditional sense, but I'd organized a few charity drives and college events back in the day. Close enough, right? I nodded. A bit. Why? She explained that their keynote speaker for a small business workshop had cancelled last minute, and they were scrambling to find someone who could step in and talk about career pivoting. Apparently, the topic was broad enough that anyone with a halfway decent story could make it work. Before I could think it through, I heard myself say, "I can do it." Looking back, I'm not sure what possessed me to volunteer. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe I just needed to prove to myself that the day wasn't a total loss. Either way, 10 minutes later, I found myself standing in front of a room full of aspiring entrepreneurs, talking about my own experiences with career uncertainty and adaptability. What started as a nervous, improvised speech turned into something almost magical. I shared anecdotes about juggling odd jobs in college, lessons I'd learned from internships, and how unexpected setbacks, like missing a job interview, could lead to unforeseen opportunities. The audience was engaged, nodding along, even laughing at my self-deprecating jokes. By the end, I felt a strange sense of fulfillment I hadn't experienced in years. Afterward, several attendees approached me to thank me for my insights. One woman even asked if I offered consulting services. I laughed it off, but the idea stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the memory of that workshop. I started researching public speaking and discovered a whole world of motivational speaking gigs. Inspired, I reached out to local organizations and pitched myself as a speaker on resilience and adaptability. To my surprise, I started booking small events. What began as an accidental opportunity grew into a full-fledged career pivot. Within a year, I was speaking at conferences, schools, and corporate events. I even started a blog to share my experiences and advice, which eventually turned into a book deal. It's funny to think that missing a job interview, something I once saw as a catastrophic failure, became the catalyst for discovering a hidden passion. Life has a way of surprising you like that. So, if you're reading this after a particularly bad day, take it from me, sometimes the detours lead to the best destinations. You just have to be willing to take the first step off the beaten path. Third story. I never thought a routine garage sale could change my life, but that's exactly what happened last summer. My parents were downsizing, preparing to move from the house where I grew up into a smaller, more manageable condo. Naturally, my sister and I were recruited to help sort through decades of accumulated treasures that had been sitting in the attic, basement, and garage. The weekend started innocently enough. We set up folding tables on the driveway, arranging everything from old books to mismatched kitchenware in neat little rows. My dad put up a sign that read, "Everything must go. Prices negotiable," while my mom brewed a pot of coffee to keep us all caffeinated. By mid-morning, we were knee-deep in negotiations with bargain hunters. My sister, Erin, had a knack for haggling, while I handled the cash box. Things were going smoothly until Mom emerged from the garage, carrying an old, dusty box I'd never seen before. "Can we put this out too?" she asked, setting it down on the table. "What's in it?" I asked, more out of curiosity than concern. "No idea," she admitted. "It's been in the attic for years. Probably just some old junk." I opened the box to take a look. Inside, I found a jumble of random items, yellowed papers, a couple of photo albums, and a small, locked wooden box. Something about it felt different, like it didn't belong with the rest of the stuff. "Where'd this come from?" I asked. Mom shrugged. "Your dad's side of the family, I think." "I don't really remember." Erin wandered over, peering into the box. "That's not junk," she said, pulling out one of the photo albums. "These look like old family photos." Intrigued, I set aside the cash box and started flipping through the album. The photos were black and white, faded with age. There were pictures of people I didn't recognize, stoic faces posed in front of old cars, children playing in fields, and women in vintage dresses. "That's weird," Erin said, pointing to one of the photos. "Doesn't that woman look like Grandma?" She was right. One of the women in the photos bore an uncanny resemblance to our grandmother, who had passed away years ago. But something didn't add up. The back of the photo was labeled Clara, 1943, and Grandma's name wasn't Clara. We asked Dad about it later that afternoon. He frowned when he saw the photo. "Where'd you find this?" he asked, his voice tinged with unease. "In the box Mom brought out," I replied. "Who's Clara?" Dad hesitated, glancing at Mom, who looked just as puzzled as we were. Finally, he sighed. "Clara was my mother's sister," he said slowly. "But we never talked about her. She disappeared when I was a kid." This was news to me and Erin. As far as we knew, Grandma was an only child. Dad's revelation left us with more questions than answers. "What do you mean, disappeared?" Erin pressed. Dad shook his head. "It was a long time ago. She just left one day and never came back." My parents didn't like to talk about it. The rest of the afternoon was a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about Clara. Who was she? Why had she disappeared? And why did no one in the family ever mention her? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the locked wooden box from the attic. I'd set it aside earlier, intending to find the key later, but now I was desperate to know what was inside. Around midnight, I grabbed a screwdriver and pried it open. Inside, I found a stack of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. They were addressed to Clara Bennett and dated between 1942 and 1945. The return address was from a man named Edward Grant. I started reading the letters, and what I discovered was nothing short of astonishing. Edward was a soldier during World War II, and from the tone of his writing, it was clear that he and Clara were deeply in love. But the letters weren't just love notes, they hinted at something more. In one of the letters, Edward mentioned that Clara was planning to leave her family to be with him, despite their objections. Another letter described how Clara had been disowned after revealing that she was pregnant with Edward's child. The last letter, dated January 1945, ended abruptly. Edward wrote that he hadn't heard from Clara in weeks and was worried about her. I was stunned. Clara's story wasn't just a family secret, it was a tragedy. I spent the next few days researching, trying to piece together what happened to her. Through online archives, I found a marriage record for Clara and Edward from 1945, but no further information. It seemed they had vanished after that. I shared everything with my family, and for the first time, Dad seemed genuinely curious about his aunt's fate. Together, we decided to dig deeper, reaching out to distant relatives and scouring public records. Eventually, we discovered that Clara and Edward had moved to a small town in Oregon after the war, where they raised a family. Clara passed away in 1987, but not before writing a memoir about her life. Her children had preserved it and were thrilled to hear from us when we reached out. Reading Clara's memoir was like stepping into another world. She wrote about her struggles, her love for Edward, and the pain of being estranged from her family. But she also wrote about her hope that, one day, her story would bring her family closer together. In a way, it did. Learning about Clara and reconnecting with her descendants brought our family closer than ever. And it all started with an old box at a garage sale. Sometimes, the past has a way of finding us, even when we're not looking for it.